everybody. Thank you, Yancy. I'm Renee from the SAMRC, the Environment and Health Research Unit. My title did change a couple of times, so the latest title is projected. So I'm not sure which one you had before, but it's today I'm going to be talking on heavy metal exposure in South Africa and related health risks. I'm going to take you on a little journey that our Environment and Health Research Unit has done involving this topic. Some of the research predates me and was done by our current director, Prof. Angie Matthey. But I've put together a couple of interesting projects we've worked on around this topic. So lead, mercury, cadmium and arsenic, which I'll be focusing on, are on the WHO's list of top 10 chemicals of public health concern. There are a couple of sources of heavy metals. Some of them are natural sources, like the eruption of volcanoes or the weathering of parent materials. Volatile metals and metals that become attached to fine particles can be widely distributed and transported on very large scales. Other sources are the man-made or anthropogenic sources of metals, including various industrial processes, mining, foundries and smelters, and the combustion of fossil fuel and gasoline. Now, the toxicity of heavy metals depends on several factors, including the dose, the route of exposure, the chemical speciation of the element, as well as the gender, age, genetics, and nutritional status of exposed individuals. Now, we can't really talk about heavy metals without talking about lead, and most people know about lead because of, various reasons, but unleaded petrol is one of the big reasons. There are many reasons that lead is used today. Obviously, lead in petrol was a historical use, but it's still used in batteries and paint, which is paints used in homes and toys and playground equipment. Used in fishing sinkers, firearms, ammunition, toys, solder, electronic equipment, and the list goes on. It's a very useful element, but it is also highly toxic. It's toxic to virtually all organ systems. That's just to show a diagram of the difference between the health effects of lead in adults and children. It affects many parts of the body. In children, it affects the brain and is linked to behavioral problems, low IQ, hearing loss, and learning disabilities. It's in adults and children, it's also linked to aggression, violent, and criminal behavior. The pathways of lead exposure. So ingestion is one of the big ones, hand to mouth pathways. It's probably 98% where people are exposed, but also you can also be exposed by respiratory or dermal exposure. The younger you are, the greater risk of the health concerns. So lead in petrol, just a brief background, pre-1980s, South Africa had amongst the highest levels of lead in petrol used anywhere in the world, and over 90% of urban children had elevated blood lead levels. The children living closest to the busy roads had much higher level of lead in their blood, and the reductions in petrol lead levels from the mid-1980s and the introduction of unleaded petrol in 1996 has led us to show the research that it has actually brought down the blood lead levels in children in South Africa and across the world. But our research that was presented to Cabinet was part of the motivation for the complete phase-out in lead. And we continue to show the trend in the lead levels decreasing over time. Lead is often also used in paint. A few of our studies are just highlighted here where we've shown elevated blood lead levels in children living in homes with peeling paint. This is around the world and it's been shown in South Africa as well. 20% of Johannesburg homes have elevated lead in the paint, highly elevated lead in lead in paint on children's toys has been found. And we've also done studies on the lead paint used in playgrounds, playground furniture in the public parks of South Africa. And of course, the high lead levels of paint in this stores still available today. But a couple of years ago, in 2009, the Department of Health declared lead paint as a Group 1 hazardous substance. But many countries have established a ban on lead paints. Unfortunately, it is still legal to sell lead paint for use in homes, schools, and other buildings. Children living in low middle income countries, where there are few government controls, are disproportionately affected by this. I know we've just had a talk on healthy soils, but I'm going to bring our attention to some less healthy soils. Of course, metals can be prevalent in urban settings, in gardens. And the 2017 Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health identified soil as an important daily route of public exposure to a variety of pollutants. Some work we did in our unit not long ago was to study 4 sites in Johannesburg, so Bertram's, Rivoli, Bromfisherville and Hospital Hill, and to collect soil samples from various gardens and then to test them for their metal content. Those are the different study sites in Johannesburg for those who are not familiar with the areas. So the 2 metals we tested was arsenic and lead. These are the results for the arsenic in garden soil. So the South African reference level for arsenic is 48 milligrams per kilogram. In Canada, it's quite a lot lower. It's 18 milligrams per kilogram. As you can see, certain samples were above our maximum reference level, particularly in Rivoli, and much higher than the more conservative Canadian level. So it would have been 56% above the Canadian reference level. Lead in garden soils was similar. There was a huge range. The maximum was 2,141 milligrams per kilogram in the soil. And in Bertram's, 32% were above the reference level for the maximum lead level concentrations, which is concerning. Possible short-term interventions around this, the lead in garden soils in urban settings. As I mentioned earlier, hand-to-mouth pathway is one of the main routes of exposure. So highlighting to communities about washing hands before eating, after playing or gardening outside, keeping nails short and clean, avoid mouthing behavior, discouraging pica, which is the eating of non-nutritional substances, which has a subset geophagia, which is specifically eating soil, which people do. To wash fruit and vegetables thoroughly before eating, and house cleaning methods. When the soil gets traipsed through the house, there are ways to use different cleaning methods, using double mopping, and there's a whole various ways to limit the exposure. So there are various ways of those metals to get into the urban soils, and one of the ways is the subsistence and cottage industries, what we call it, work that people are doing in their backyards to bring an extra income. This is an example of a lead exposure challenge in subsistence fishing communities in South Africa. It was prompted by anecdotal reports of lead melting of lead to craft fishing sinkers. We did a cross-sectional study of blood lead levels of young children in 2 remote fishing villages. The results showed that the blood lead levels ranged from 2.2 to 22.4 milligrams per deciliter, which is quite high. The study showed that local fisher folk were collecting waste lead from wheel balancing alignment centers and lost sinkers and melting them to make new sinkers to fit their needs. So these are the type of exposures that are happening in people's gardens or backyards, which are exposing the families, communities, and of course the children to these issues. This was a public, based on that research, was a public education material and outreach material that we did to inform communities about the harmful nature of lead, especially in those fishing villages when people are melting lead down. Okay, so I'm going to move on slightly to metals in traditional medicines, something that I've been involved in for quite many years now. And the WHO does recognize plant, animals, and or minerals or metals in traditional medicines. Now, the metals can get to traditional medicines unintentionally in the plants through agricultural practices, if there's soil with high contaminants, or the way that plants are transported. But some of it is just deliberate addition of metals to traditional medicines. So Ayurvedic medicine, for example, has been practiced in India for millennia. It's gained increased popularity beyond the Indian subcontinent in recent decades, and it has a name for the deliberate inclusion of minerals and metals, which is Rasa Shastra. So each metal has a different name, and in Rasa Shastra these metals are added for their efficacy in the traditional medicines. So about 20% of Ayurvedic preparations do contain lead in various proportions, various dosages. There have been health alerts issued in many countries, including USA, UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Spain, regarding the high content of lead in these Ayurvedic products. And there's a growing public health concern, especially in the light of direct internet sales. So a couple of years ago in South Africa, in Durban, there was a lead poisoning outbreak among adolescents who were associated with the consumption of Ayurvedic medicine for the treatment of skin conditions. They had been consuming this medication for a couple of months, and when a new batch came in, they developed some strange symptoms. We managed to get the background information and do some blood level testing and gather other information on 8 of the people, and 4 other had immigrated. So the range of symptoms during the acute phase of exposure, you can see them listed there, but from irritability, vomiting, emotional instability, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, nosebleeds, headaches. Nobody could quite figure out, though, what was happening. Eventually, when they did the blood lead levels, they could show that the blood lead levels were extremely high in these 8 participants, and considering the maximum brain should be 5 micrograms per deciliter, these results are really off the charts. And a couple of months later, you can see it says current, but that was during the time of the study, that's how the blood lead level had come down. But these individuals needed chelation therapy, and they still have ongoing issues. So these capsules we actually tested as well that were implicated. The maximum recommendation for the daily intake is, there is a minimum allowance, is 20 micrograms. The lab analysis of these capsules showed that there were 71,000 micrograms, and the exposure level was exceeded the guideline by a factor of 14,000. So this was really so it can just take one batch of badly prepared medicine to cause such a scare. So metals are used in African traditional medicine as well. A few years ago, again in Durban, I'm not sure what it is with Durban, an occupational cohort had an unexplained level of potassium dichromate, potassium permanganate, potassium dichromate in their blood during pre-employment screenings. So various hypotheses were put forward, and including the medicinal use of a class 1 carcinogen known as, well, it's hexavalent chrome. In African traditional medicine, it's known as Indonesia. I was actually tasked with leading this particular study. I did a bit of field research and talking to a couple of traditional healers. The reason this was introduced was a few decades ago, the Trichelia emetica tree, Natal mahogany, was used in traditional medicine, but the berries of this tree, or the seeds, were poisonous. And they needed an alternative, a substitute, and started noticing, especially in Durban, there's a very big Indian community, and noticing these powders that were used in the Indian Ayurvedic traditional medicine. And it was decided that that looked like a good substitute, and this was introduced as a safer alternative. Obviously it wasn't safer, but it was an alternative to using these toxic seeds. So we interviewed almost 400 traditional healers, and we bought over 300 mutis within Indonesia, and after interviewing the healers, 72% of them prescribed Indonesia for healing purposes. The primary route that it was given was by enema. The mutis that we tested ranged between 4 micrograms per litre and 53 grams per litre, noting that the maximum limit for drinking water is 50 micrograms. And the human intake varied from 7.5 to 4.5 grams per single dose. So while doing the study, I spent some time in traditional chemists, and unfortunately I don't have a pointer, but the picture on my far right, your left, you can see the shelf is filled with colorful powders. Those are various salts and metals used in the traditional medicine. So I took a whole lot to the lab, as you can see in those little containers, and wanted to test them to see what they were. This is Babcele. He's my traditional healer that works with me closely on the project. Sadly, he's passed away since. He was 93, an amazing healer. And we took the samples to the lab and put them through ran through the scanning electron microscopy. And what we found, so we managed to identify 7. One of them was, one of the salts was ammonium chloride, calcium sulfate, sulfur. I know you're going to have a talk later on fertilizers, but these are fertilizers, so I won't go too much depth about this, but obviously shouldn't be used for human consumption. Copper sulfate was another one, potassium permanganate, and iron chromate ore, which I think is not widely available, not widely used, but a very interesting mix of things in there. It might have been scooped up from a mine or something, but it's used. So the one, I knew what it was already. I'd already studied it for ages, obviously, as I said, was potassium dichromate. But when we put it through the SEM, I was very surprised to see that it came out as table salt, NaCl. So I asked him to repeat it and repeat it again, because I knew that this wasn't table salt. But in fact, it was table salt. So now we have 2 types of Indonesia. One is the weaker one, which is dyed table salt. It's dyed bright orange, and the naked eye cannot tell the difference. And then there's the strong one, the hexavalent chrome. Obviously, you would not want to mix those 2 up. So yes, Indonesia is used in traditional medicine, but there's also this other one that can be used as a substitute. During that same investigation, one of the things I didn't have to put through the microscope was mercury. That was also found widely available. You can buy it in pill vials at the traditional medicine market. So I decided to interview 200 healers on the use of 7 imikandu. So imikandu is the name for all of the metal salts used together. And I'm just going to share with you the details of the mercury and the copper sulfates.